In 2003, a Brazilian businessman was handcuffed at JFK and held for 3 days because an officer didn't like his invitation letter. And then in 2025, a 65-year-old British grandmother was held for 6 weeks for no reason at all. 20 years apart, but the same story. America's border has become a dragnet, and tourists are the collateral damage. Welcome to Unhospitality.
Unhospitality, the #1 podcast in the world.
So most of you know what I do. I book meetings and events around the world. I spent 13 years in the hotel side of the industry. And in 2012, so 14 years ago, I left the hotel side to represent clients as they plan meetings and events around the world. It's a great gig, something that keeps me in the air, traveling all the time and seeing fantastic destinations. So this week I've been negotiating with some hotels in Greece, in Athens, for a program in 2027. It's a relatively large program, about 200 people or so, 175, 200. And I am shocked, absolutely shocked at the price increase. This particular program is in Europe this year, and year-over-year increases in this program have me like, I cannot believe how high the prices have gotten in just 1 year. Now, we're different countries, but it's the same market overall. In fact, I would expect the market we're headed to in 2027 to be even lower. We're going from Scotland to Greece. We're negotiating back and forth, and these folks are, sometimes hotels will lead with this crazy rate and then negotiate back. And in this particular case, a hotel's not negotiating back much. And I'm seeing it as a sign that business and travel in Europe is really, really strong. Counter, I'm booking some deals in the US, and I'm noticing the hotels are a lot more flexible. I started to think, is this a trend? Are we seeing increase in business in Europe and in other destinations and a decrease in the US? It got me doing some research and going down a little bit of a rabbit hole. So I ran into a couple stories that shed a little light as to what's going on. I mentioned it at the top of the show. Carlos Mendez was a Sao Paulo-based businessman. He was coming to the U.S. on a valid visa. And what happened when he came to JFK Airport in New York City for a conference, essentially Customs and Border Patrol agents didn't like his entry letter. You needed to enter with a letter stating what your business was. Customs and Border Patrol agents stopped him and claimed his letter for entry was a little too vague. They didn't give many more reasons than that. And what they did was they held him in a windowless cell at the airport detention center. He was handcuffed during interrogations. He was denied phone calls, and he was released only after his company's lawyers had to intervene. He was held for 72 hours in detention. He missed his conference. He never returned to the U.S. for business. I don't think I would either if I was treated like that. But why does that matter? Stories like that spread throughout the Latin American business community, and that led to a 40% drop in Brazilian visitors from 2001 to 2004. 40% drop, imagine that. Now, just this past year, in 2025, Karen Newton, she's a 65-year-old retired teacher from Leeds, United Kingdom. Now, she also had a valid tourist visa, so there's nothing wrong with her paperwork. She got to the U.S. for a trip of a lifetime. She couldn't wait for this trip and hadn't traveled for 8 years, in fact, and came to the U.S. to shake off her travel doldrums and have an amazing time. When she got to her routine checkpoint, she was handcuffed, and then she was transported for 12 hours to an ICE detention center. She slept on a locked cell floor. She was denied proper medical care for her hypertension and held 42 days before being deported back to the UK. There were no charges ever filed. Nothing was ever proven wrong with her paperwork, and she was detained for 42 days. Those were incidents that are 25 years apart. The only claim that was leveled against her was there were visa terms violations, but nothing was ever specified why. Her direct quote was, "Don't go to the U.S. If this can happen to me with my clean record and valid visa, it can happen to anybody." It's kind of a scary story. So why does this matter? Well, of course, this story goes viral in the UK. And year to date in 2026, arrivals from the UK into the US are down 15%. And this seems like a trend that's only going to continue. There's an entire system of how hotels track their success or failure. If they're growing, if they're contracting, how they're doing against competing markets. It's called Smith Travel Research. They're called the STAR reports, STR. And this gives you indications of what your rates are year over year, what your occupancy levels are year over year, and what your overall RevPAR is. RevPAR is kind of like a fancy insider's term for revenue per occupied room, okay? So it tells you how much essentially people are spending on your property. These numbers are tracked. They're all submitted, and you get to kind of see where you're doing within your market, in the competition, and where you're doing internationally as well. When the numbers came out for 2025 total year in January of this year, there was a historic reversal in fortunes for hotels in the US. US hotels saw a decline in both occupancy and RevPAR year over year. It's a clear signal that tourism slowdown was not just a forecast as many people thought it would happen in 2025, but it became a reality. The markets that were hit the hardest, New York City lost 4.2% RevPAR year over year. Miami lost 3.9%, Los Angeles 3.1%, and San Francisco a whopping 5.6% backwards in RevPAR year over year. Again, RevPAR is revenue per available room. And why does this stand out? This is not a global recession. In fact, it's the opposite. Other markets are surging. And it goes back to my point negotiating with this hotel in Greece. Europe is up 3.2% overall in RevPAR year over year. France is up 4.1%. Italy is up 3.8%. Spain is up a whopping 5.4%. You look at the Middle East, they're up 6.7%. Canada is up 2.1%. And Mexico is up 4.9% RevPAR year over year. Compare that to the backwards numbers in the US, you're anywhere between a 5 to 6% difference in some of these major markets of what's happening in terms of growth or contraction. Smith Travel Research put it like this: 2025 was the first year since the pandemic that the US has actually lost revenue year over year. It fell. Didn't grow slower. It actually fell and went backwards. Occupancy down 1.3%, rates down, and RevPAR down 1.7%. Contrast that to markets in Europe and Canada and Mexico that are breaking records. The US seems to be the only one suffering this slump. And here's the killer stat among all of them. International visitors, the highest spending guest, by the way, dropped 8.5% last year in 2025. That's not a rounding error. That's a boycott. International travelers are voting with their feet and not coming to the US. So I started looking for some historical context for this, and I found some. We saw this in post 9/11 US as well. The US turned the Statue of Liberty into a bouncer. There was all this heightened awareness of potential terrorists coming in. The pendulum swung so far in trying to protect ourselves from supposed terrorists that international travel dropped 13% in 2002, a humongous number. I don't know if you guys will remember this, but there was this saying back in the day. It was like, the terrorists will win. If you do that, the terrorists will win. There was such a heightened awareness for terrorism in the US, it became the blanket to cover anything. If you don't eat your vegetables, well, then the terrorists will win. If you wear white after Labor Day, well, then the terrorists will win. It was this whole thing about terrorism being the big scary boogeyman, which had legitimate roots in what happened in 9/11. I don't want to take anything away from the tragedy there. But when you look at the way the pendulum swung and how we cracked down so hard at any potential influx of terrorism, it really had a negative effect on the economy and on tourism in the United States. And just like today, the slump wasn't just related to safety concerns. It was humiliating entry experiences. It was people being interrogated for no reason at all. We really swung the pendulum hard in trying to protect the borders. That deterred visitors more than anything because the story started to circulate that it was really hard to get into the US without a hassle. Now, it took a full 6 years, post 9/11 for the US to return to numbers previous to 9/11 numbers. So in other words, that gap that we created by cracking down on terrorism so much, or supposedly cracking down on terrorism, impacted the economy for 6 years for 6 years in the hospitality industry for it to recover to 2001 levels. We saw this happen in Thailand. In 2014, there was a coup and military rule ensued from 14 to 16. What happened? Well, after the military ousted the elected government, Thailand imposed martial law, arbitrary detentions, and a strict visa enforcement. That impacted tourism. European travel dropped 10 to 15% in 2014 and 2015, and tourism revenue fell by $3 billion with a B in Thailand due to the crackdown. What this shows is when we have political instability and heavy-handed enforcement overreach, tourism becomes collateral damage. And a top-tier tourism brand can get eroded very, very quickly. You've heard that saying that a lie can go around the world twice before truth can get up and put on its pants. Well, fear has that same effect. Once fear grips a society or people fear going to a certain destination, tourism starts to dip. In this case, fear spreads faster than any marketing campaign can fix. The question isn't whether the US will recover. The question is, how long will it take? Will it take another 6 years, 7 years, 10 years, a decade? just like it did after post 9/11, to recover from what we're currently doing at the borders and creating this fear for people entering the country. And sure, there are a lot of counter arguments to keeping this kind of enforcement up, right? They rest on a crucial distinction. Targeted enforcement of violent criminals is way different than broad crackdown on tourists and low risk visa holders. There's just not a comparison. The data actually suggests that the current approach is making America less safe and not more. How so? Well, those in favor say these crackdowns make us safer. But what the data shows is that when you detain grandmothers and law abiding citizens with valid visas, you're not stopping terrorists, you're stopping tourism. You're stopping a $1 billion industry, or at least hampering it, if not stopping it altogether. And in the process, you're making it harder for real crime victims to call 911 because of the terror that's in the streets. You're pulling FBI agents off of counterterrorism cases, and you're targeting a population and a group of people that actually commit less crime than citizens of the US, the people who were native born. That's not safety, that's theater. And the ticket price is 10 to 13 billion in tourism dollars alone this year. That's the projected loss in tourism dollars in 2026, 12 to 13 billion dollars. As I wind this down, one of the most critical things that comes to mind as I think about this entire situation is that I made my life and my career in tourism. My oldest child works in tourism. My wife works in tourism. Most of my friends across the world are in tourism. These are my friends. Particularly in the US, this downward spiral in international arrivals is having a very negative effect on their livelihood. Because here's the cruel irony. Hotels are laying off workers because of the drop in revenue and the backwards numbers that we just talked about in RevPAR, and because tourists aren't coming in. But the workers who remain there, they're working even harder. They're often asked to cover more shifts because there's less workers on property. Now, opens up a whole can of worms of the ethics of hotels and how they hire people and leaving people short staffed in the first place while they continue to rake in money. It's a whole nother conversation for another day. We talk about many things in hospitality, and maybe that will be a topic we cover into the future. But let's just focus on the reality that housekeepers these days are cleaning 22 rooms, front office staff are taking double shifts, having to work around the clock. It's really a cruel position these folks are put in. And then those who are obviously impacted by layoffs or cut hours in this economy that continues to climb and inflation continues, when you're working less hours, you don't cover the bills. That's a harsh reality for a lot of people working in tourism these days. Tips are down, hours are cut in half. And let's not forget the chilling effect that these crackdowns have had on the backbone of the hospitality industry in the US, immigrants. Some of them are too afraid to show up to work, and that is also having a negative impact, not only on how the hotels are operating and flowing, but of course on the family lives of these immigrants who are too scared to even show up when crackdowns are happening in their communities. This isn't just a tourism slump, it's a humanitarian crisis within inside our hotels. And that's what we're talking about. And we're just on the precipice of summer. Keep in mind that summer business has a ton of seasonal workers, people who come in and just work 3 to 4 months in the summertime. If conditions don't improve, expect this to get worse and not better. What's that going to do to service levels and the continued rush and the continued pressure on the hotel workers that are around to perform with more hours and less resources? It's going to put a crunch on this industry in a way that's going to be felt even deeper than we're feeling it now. Putting at risk a generation of experienced staff that's going to go to retail, to logistics, to healthcare. These are all sectors that are currently offering better pay, more stability, and even a bit more dignity in what they're asking from their workers. So there it is, guys. My search for understanding as to why prices were so up in Europe and we're starting to see a softening in prices in the US. That's it. It's happening at our borders, and we're seeing a decline in the US tourism while other markets are shifting up. What are your thoughts about this, guys? How has this impacted you? You work in tourism. I know a lot of my followers and listeners are in the industry day to day. I'd really be curious as to how this is impacting you. Are you having to pick up more shifts because of people quitting or hotels downsizing? Are you seeing less business come into your hotels? Let me know in the comments. Reach out to me directly. I'd love to hear from you. Let's start a conversation around this. If history is an indicator, this is going to impact us long beyond 2026. Thanks for tuning in, guys. We are Unhospitality, the #1 podcast in the world. Until the next time, safe travels.